I spent years setting centerpieces and rehearsing polite smiles, but the night they mocked me in front of a room full of donors, I simply stood up and walked out. My name is Eleanor, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to... I have always loved parties the way some people love gardens. Attention to detail, the right light, the scent of jasmine tucked under the tent. When I married Thomas, it felt less like joining a family and more like inheriting a role that fit me by accident. He ran Bradford and Carrington, a prestigious investment firm his father had built, and I became the woman who made them look like a community pillar. For 20 years, I wrote donor letters at midnight, negotiated silent auction items, and learned the names of the clients who mattered. I did it because I believed in taking care of people, and because I liked the way a well-run fundraiser could knit strangers into something useful. At first, it was small things. I would spend a week calling caterers until the asparagus was perfect. I learned lighting cues and how to seat a shy board member next to a talkative philanthropist, so they both left feeling buoyed. Thomas called those nights our work, as if the firm and our marriage were the same organism. He acknowledged me in speeches as the quiet engine, and that label became my private laugh. The board gave me an office with a second-hand desk and asked me to keep outside matters tidy. I paid the floral bills out of our joint account on more than one desperate Sunday when a sponsor forgot to transfer funds. I never once posted a photo of a check I'd written. Social media isn't the point when you do this kind of labor. A new event arrived the year I set up the Family Foundation, a gesture Thomas described as legacy housekeeping. I named it the Bradford Family Foundation because tradition sounded better with our name on the letterhead. What the board didn't know was that I had insisted the foundation's operating authority be in my name, not his. It was a choice born of practical caution, grant approvals, signatures, and a caretaker to steer donations toward causes that actually mattered to me. That small bureaucratic detail would become my only real leverage later, but at the time I kept it secret like a houseplant I watered gladly. Before I could even process the scale of my involvement, my stepchildren began arriving to dinner with air of entitlement already polished. Olivia had Thomas's bone structure and an education from an Ivy League, while Mark had swagger and the kind of quick jokes that landed when they were aimed at someone else. They moved in and out of our house like tourists, taking clean towels and advice with equal casualness. They skipped family board meetings, called the gala an old thing, and yet expected the Family Foundation's check to smooth their social life, matching their donations, underwriting a table or two, keeping their names in programs. I laughed along at parties until the laugh felt like a muscle trained to hurt. The subtle disrespect began as 1,000 little things stitched into evenings. A plate left in the sink after a dinner where I had made my famous lemon chicken. A text asking me to make space at the table for a wealthy client's friend without bothering to mention that it pushed me to a side table in the back. When it was my birthday, I found the card tucked under a teacup, unsigned. I learned to tolerate interruptions during conversations with clients, Olivia's voice over mine, Mark's phone snatched out to show a video because the firm's happiness seemed to demand my flexibility. People thanked me with hollow phrases and expected more. I learned to accept so much that the boundary between kindness and erasure thinned in my hands. A few months before the gala that would change everything, Thomas praised my stamina at a board retreat and then left to take a private call where he discussed hedge strategies without telling me about a merger meeting planned for the firm. I listened to him rehearse numbers through the door and fix the napkin folds until midnight. The foundation paid for the dinner, the staff, and the silent auction vintage that drew applause. I was proud, exhausted, and invisible in the same breath. When the accountants asked who would sign the foundation's sponsorship letter to secure the firm's place as presenting partner, Thomas shrugged and said, "Eleanor handles that." He thought so little of the name on the letterhead that he didn't notice I had quietly signed his authority away years before, making the Foundation's bank signatory, the trust agreements, and the donation approvals my responsibility alone. They called me gracious. They called me reliable. I was the seamstress of their public faces and the quiet backbone of private obligations. But being indispensable doesn't mean you are loved, and being loved doesn't pay the bills when people stop behaving like adults. The people who sat at my tables took my labor for granted, and I told myself variations of patience, that they would come around eventually, that they'd grow out of the small cruelties. It is amazing how many ways people will assume your silence is consent. I had no idea how far that assumption could be stretched. The night of the gala began like every other gala I had orchestrated, a rehearsal of hands, lights, and intention. I checked the guest list, refolded napkins, and smoothed a dress that had seen better nights but fit me like a second skin. At the entrance, society moved in practice lines, donors giddy to be seen, staff whispering last-minute notes. Olivia arrived late, in a gown that matched a high society client's, deliberate, I thought, of the kind of petty one-upmanship that becomes performance. Mark drifted through conversations, offering a joke or a compliment when it benefited him. Thomas, preoccupied with a hedge fund conversation over the phone, kissed my cheek and told me to enjoy the room. He meant it the way a man might tell someone to enjoy a show while he tended to the business. A new event unfolded when Olivia and Mark began whispering about tables like it was a game. I watched as they negotiated seating with a kind of casual cruelty, the way people arrange china at an auction. "We need to please Armitage," Olivia said, referring to a major donor who had been rude to me before. "He doesn't like older energy." Her words were clipped, practiced. They moved to the event manager and requested a change. Put Eleanor at the back, near the kitchen door. Put her where the clients couldn't see her. The event manager hesitated because in the past I had been seated front and center as the hostess, but pressure came from people with larger checks, and I heard him say, apologetically, "It's just logistics." My hands trembled as I accepted the polite lie. Before I could even feel the humiliation, Armitage and his wife were seated at the prime table, and I found myself at a folding table behind the servers, the tent poles and stacks of catering trays forming a stage between me and the room. I smiled. I clapped when asked. I laughed when someone told a joke about market volatility. Inside, I felt a slow, spreading cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Thomas flirted with power across the table like it was a separate life, and his eyes did not seek mine once. When I rose to present the Foundation's work, 2 donors in the front row exchanged a look and an audible smirk. One of them said too loudly, "You're brave for still coming." Brave felt like a synonym for old. Something unexpected happened during the program. A young reporter who had been given a seat, assigned by Olivia for reasons I would later learn, were to curry favor, leaned over to take notes, and asked about the host in the back. The comment made its way through the room like a drunk at a wedding. A woman at a nearby table, a supporter of the firm, stood up and offered me a hand that felt like both pity and insult. That small, public kindness didn't help. It only underscored the message that I belonged in the background. A new event occurred when a photo of me trying to smile at the back table circulated that evening. Someone took a sympathetic photo and sent it to a gossip column with a caption that made me sound like a forgotten relic. The next morning, messages flooded in, friends worried, donors confused, a dozen cruel comments. Olivia sent a text, "You should have handled it better." Mark sent a meme he thought was funny. Thomas called to say the firm's board was concerned about optics and asked me to make a public statement that evening, softening the blow. Their arrogance was a curious mix of entitlement and professional distance. They genuinely believed they were justified in protecting client relationships by diminishing me. By the time my breaking point arrived, it was not a single insult, but a pattern made visible. The next morning at 9 a.m., Thomas sat across from me at our kitchen table with the newspaper open to the business section. Bradford and Carrington's PR team had already called. They wanted the foundation to publicly reaffirm the firm's commitment to the charity. It would clear this up, Thomas suggested, fingers folded as if he were offering me a menu. A big statement. The foundation can mention our shared values. He spoke like someone arranging a chessboard. I had kept the authority to approve the foundation's grants and sponsorships for reasons I'd named practical. Now, it shone for another reason. I could put an end to the pretense without a public spectacle. I could stop feeding the machine that erased me. The decision did not come with fireworks. I felt no need for theatrics. It steadied like a hinge closing. I told Thomas, in a voice colder than either of us expected, that I would not be the sacrificial placeholder anymore. If you want me to issue a statement, I said, then I will cancel the sponsorship. I'll withdraw the $1 million corporate sponsorship effective immediately. He blinked, the way men do when a safe assumption is challenged. He had always assumed my loyalty would be quiet and immediate. He did not expect the ledger of my patience to balance. That afternoon, I walked into the room where I kept the foundation files, a small study with a battered map on the wall and a safe in the closet. I pulled an old photo album from the top shelf before I sat down, pictures of volunteer days with battered hands and children smiling, my wedding day, a younger Thomas holding me like we were the only thing that mattered. I ran my thumb along a page where a toddler had glued glitter to paper and smiled up at me with trust. The photos were not weapons. They were evidences of years I had invested believing in something. They were also a map of what I had let be taken. A decision felt less like anger and more like clarity. I opened the ledger, found the foundation's corporate sponsorship agreement, and read the fine print as if it were a love letter turned contract. The document allowed the foundation's president, the signatory, to revoke pledges within a specified window for failure of shared purpose. I took a slow breath and made a list of all the automatic payments I had allowed to continue. The gala's yearly underwriting, the children's scholarship fund set to renew, the matching grants I had quietly approved at Thomas's request. Each line felt like a chain I had forged myself. Before I could second guess, I drafted a letter. I signed it with the same pen Thomas had given me on an anniversary, a pen that had been used to sign off on 1,000 small mercies and a few public statements. My handwriting did not tremble. I typed the email to the foundation banker who handled our accounts. Cancellation notice attached, effective immediately. Then I called the firm's head of philanthropy, a man named Gerald, who had always deferred to me in a way that felt like recognition. "There's no negotiation," I said into the receiver. "The $1 million sponsorship is withdrawn." He stammered on the other end, the polite panic of someone about to lose a major line item. A new event followed when I walked into the dining room and packed a small suitcase. I did not pack to run. I packed to be away. I folded 2 blouses, a cardigan, and a book I had never finished. I wrote a note to Thomas and left it on the piano. "I need a moment of quiet. I am handling the foundation withdrawal. Don't interrupt." Then I walked through the back door, the same one I had used that night when my chair had been moved, and called a driver. The south of France had nothing to do with punishment. It had everything to do with the idea of space and the restorative possibility of air that did not carry gossip. On the plane, I read the email thread that would be the small first collapse, Gerald's reply asking for reconsideration, a terse note from Bradford and Carrington's legal counsel demanding formal notice and, in caps, immediate discussion. My hands did not shake. I felt only the steadiness of someone closing a door. When I landed, the villa in Provence smelled like lavender and old stone. I set my suitcase by the bed and made a pot of coffee. The simple ritual of pouring and sipping tasted like freedom before I could even learn the shapes of the next days. A firm in New York called. The caller ID showed Thomas's assistant, her voice trembling with the awareness that she was the bearer of other people's fear. "They're saying the sponsorship is gone," she said. "They're calling the board." Her sentence dissolved into a cascade of obligations I had no appetite for. I listened and answered in measured tones. "It's done," I said. "The foundation withdrawal is binding." Her silence was louder than any argument. I mailed the formal revocation letter that evening and canceled the automatic transfers from the foundation's account. I signed a stack of cancellation forms and removed my name from the event lead paragraph on the foundation's website. Then I burned an old program from a gala that had my name on the cover, not as a gesture of triumph, but to remove a symbol that tethered me to a role I had worn until it no longer fit. The flames licked the glossy paper and turned my handwriting into ash that smelled faintly of perfumed hallways and varnished tables. The image of that small, private burn is what closed the chapter, the sound of paper turning to air. They say markets sleep and wake like people, and sometimes a small event becomes a tremor that grows into an earthquake. The next morning, Bradford and Carrington's public relations team sent out a wire wondering about the sudden withdrawal of a major corporate sponsor. The Times picked up on a rumor that the foundation pulled its $1 million sponsorship and wrote a piece that framed the withdrawal as a vote of no confidence in the firm's current direction. Overnight, investors who had been lukewarm grew nervous. The stock dipped. The board called an emergency meeting. Before I could even finish my coffee that morning in Provence, my phone lit up with messages. Gerald sent a pleading text asking if there was any way to negotiate. Thomas called 3 times, then sent a terse email to me titled, "Unacceptable." Board members left voicemails that climbed the scale from confused to furious to quietly threatening. A new event unfurled when Olivia posted a defensively worded statement on her social account claiming the family had been misrepresented. Mark posted a selfie outside the office with a caption that read, "We will handle this." They believed they could spin it into damage control, not realizing the real damage had already begun to take shape. Within 48 hours, the firm felt the pressure in ways that had nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with the books. A major client request for a matching gift was parked pending clarity, and a smaller nonprofit the firm had promised to seed lost confidence and pulled their future engagements. The firm's liquidity matters began to show in the boardroom. Covenants tied to philanthropic backing were suddenly loose. Investors called in favor calls. One hedge fund reduced a line of credit over a perceived weakness. The numbers, which had always been abstract, started to have teeth. An unexpected twist happened when an internal audit, requested as part of the firm's damage control, turned up irregularities in the foundation's grant disbursements. The audit flagged transfers that didn't match grant approvals, payments siphoned to shell vendors and personal accounts. The auditors traced a pattern that led straight to a name, Mark Bradford. He had access to certain administrative accounts because he'd been helping out and had taken advantage of the loosened oversight. The irony was brutal and clean. My quitting the funding had forced a scrutiny that revealed embezzlement the family had never looked for. Problems compounded quickly. Once an internal phone line reported the audit, one of the firm's philanthropic partners backed out entirely, citing fiduciary concerns. The board demanded an emergency forensic review, and lawyers flooded the inboxes. The chairman, a man who had admired Thomas as a peer for decades, asked for his resignation. Thomas, who had always believed the family name could protect him from consequence, found himself in the eye of a storm with shareholders on one side and regulators on the other. The spillover spilled into private life. People who had sat beside him at galas stopped returning calls. Before I could be accused of gloating, let me be clear, I did not dance on a ruin. I watched like someone who had made a living tending fires, learning the shapes of smoke. The consequences were real and painful for many, but they were not orchestrated by me in a vengeful rush. I had set a boundary and allowed the world to respond. The twist that emerged, Mark's embezzlement, was not mine to publicize, and yet it was the natural consequence of the removal of a blindfold. The foundation's withdrawal had done something I'd never expected. It revealed a rot that had been growing unseen. One evening, 2 weeks after my decision, Olivia flew to Provence. She arrived at the villa with her hair pulled back and a statement about miscommunications. She sat on the terrace where the light across the grapevines felt generous and asked me to help fix this. Her plea was quick, practiced. She spoke of damage control, shareholder lists, and reputational harm to the family. Her voice sometimes quivered, but not always. Thomas called and left a message begging me to come home for the family. He sounded smaller than I had ever remembered. Olivia's plea felt like a demand cloaked in fear. I listened without interruption. When she reached to take my hand across the table, I withdrew it. That small movement marked the difference between the life I had been living and the one I had chosen. "You should call your board," I told her. "You should call your investors. You should fix what you broke." She blinked as if I had not given her permission to be an adult. She had not yet learned that the world does not rearrange itself at the request of entitlement. A new event occurred when Mark called from a distant airport with an unsteady voice. The firm's legal team had frozen accounts tied to him. He asked for money, for bailouts, for a wire transfer. He tried the old tactics: charm, apology, threats veiled as panic. I listened, and I said nothing that would put me back into the role of silent rescuer. "I am not your bank," I told him. My words were small and precise. "I won't be sending money." He pleaded about a mortgage and a business loan. I had once co-signed, thinking family was a safe risk. I had not fully understood the cost of assuming the role of guarantor for other people's choices. The last few weeks brought a chorus of apologies delivered too late. Board members texted me, some apologetic, some scolding. Thomas's calls became less frequent. Pride stubbornly complicated grief. Olivia sent a flurry of messages asking for one more chance. She came to the villa twice, sat on the terrace each time, and left with her composure flattened but her insistence intact. They came crawling, hearts bared in the same way people beg for their reputations, hoping a hand would be extended. But my reply was steady. I had withdrawn my support. I would not reintroduce the financing that had enabled their negligence. Before I could settle into a full sense of what peace looked like, I found beauty in small, ordinary things. I began to write letters to the charity grantees I had loved, local libraries, after-school music programs, a literacy initiative, and told them they would receive transitional support from the foundation for the remainder of the fiscal year, but not beyond. I did this because abandoning the causes would have been cruel. I also did it because kindness does not require my ruin. The people on the receiving end of those letters wrote back with handwritten notes, gratitude that tasted like genuine thanks, not the performative clapping of a gala. A twist of grace occurred when the community that had been quietly served started sending invitations to local events in the village. Small harvest dinners, a knitting circle that needed a table, a women's reading group. I went to them not as a social duty, but because I wanted to be there. I planted tomatoes. I learned the names of neighbors who had no interest in my husband's firm or my last gala's menu. They were interested in whether you had time to listen. One afternoon, as an ordinary sun slanted across the stone steps, Thomas came to the villa. He stood at the gate and looked like a man who had learned suddenly that being central to a story does not guarantee a good ending. He asked once more if we could work it out. I handed him a cup of tea and asked him about the house we had in Connecticut, about the garden he loved. He spoke about shareholders and lawyers, as if those words could replace the distance he had created. I watched him untangle his hands around a cup, and I felt only a calm that had the shape of finality. I did not need speeches or dramatic reconciliations. I offered him the courtesy of clarity. I would no longer serve as quiet collateral for his professional life. I would not erase inconvenient truths. The last image I kept before I left Provence for good was modest. Me, on a small terrace, drinking coffee at dawn with a mug that had a tiny chip on one side. I planted rosemary in a broken pot and watched the plant toughen in the sun. I spent an afternoon repairing a chair with my own hands, sanding and recovering it. Healing, I discovered, is composed of repeated small acts of repair rather than a single grand gesture. I fed the neighbor's cat when it came by. I read a book out loud to women at the library and laughed at jokes that had nothing to do with fundraising. They were ordinary, human moments that had been absent from my life for too long. As the months passed, Olivia and Mark's calls became less frequent. The firm reorganized, lawyers argued, and Mark faced consequences he had not expected. Thomas carved his life into something smaller and quieter than the headlines, and I stopped being part of his public currency. I did not need vindication. I needed the dignity of my own days.
The end of the story is not fireworks. It is the quiet ritual of making tea in the morning and tending a garden where the herbs respond to steady hands. When people ask how it felt to stop funding the thing that had been my identity for so long, I say it felt like catching my breath after holding it for decades. I lost a place at a table, but I gained the whole terrace. The firm lost a sponsorship and learned, painfully, what it means to be accountable. The children learned, also painfully, what it means to be adults. If you have watched all the way here, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. There is a particular comfort in knowing we are not alone in our small, steady rebellions. Don't forget to subscribe to protect your peace.